These are sort of general questions, and there is a big one here, which is one of heartbreak and plea. For those of us living in countries with little or no medical support, where do you suggest we go for treatment? Will we have to wait for clinical tests to ask our insurance providers for support and payment for travel for treatment? Well, the answer to that is you're not going to get insurance support. If people who are trying to make ME/CFS into a behavioural and mental disorder get their way, because behavioural and mental disorders are excluded from most, if not all, insurance contracts with people who take out medical insurance. And that's the sad truth. So it is very important that we hang on to this biomedical work and say this is not a behavioural and mental disorder. And that's not to insult people who've got behavioural and mental disorders, but people with mental and behavioural disorders do not have CFSME. They have a mental and behavioural disorder. And again, this was shown very clearly, I think, by Lenny. Would you like to comment about that, Lenny? Yes.
Actually, several people during intermission asked me similar types of questions, and I guess what I've tried to say is that any chronic, serious, significant health condition can impact a person's mental health.
Yeah.
And clearly, when a person has cancer or serious heart disease or AIDS, there are sometimes mental health implications of that.
Yeah.
It's a consequence of having that type of serious condition. We certainly want to make sure that that person gets appropriate treatment. However, what's inappropriate and what's probably unusual with this condition is why would they just say focus on one thing when all the other physical aspects of the condition need appropriate treatment? And why wouldn't those particular pieces be something that we think a multidisciplinary team with expertise in different areas needs to come together to focus on? That's the tragedy that's happening with this illness.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's it. Well done. I think some of this question has partly been answered, but you may want to comment further, people in the panel. ME may affect just one member of the family, while others remain healthy. This is the conundrum of, if you look at families either vertically or horizontally, you can see one sibling out of 6 goes down, but the others don't, but they all live close together. What's going on? How are people being protected with the close family genetic links that are there in ways that are allowing only one of them to go down, and the vertical transmission with parents? Well, Judy's talked about this with the XMRV study, and these questions about why are difficult questions. We can speculate like mad, but do we have any real clues about why this might be something that is something we don't understand yet, but it just happens like that?
No, other than that, we tend to see a bit of an inverse relationship with the antibodies. So in the sickest people, we won't see the antibodies. So it might be that there's a powerful immune response that is effective in this virus infection, unlike HIV. And since the virus doesn't change that much, it's not a moving target. So we think that we're actively exploring the immune response to the virus, and if these antibodies could indeed be used therapeutically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Nancy, yes, please.
Kathy Rowe in Australia and then David Bell in the States have both presented long-term data on heritability, mother or father to child. Runs around 25% in their data. The good news is that the children tend to do a lot better than the adults, and many grow out of or at least get much better over time. But that 1 in 4 number certainly suggests some genetics, because a 1 in 4 is a famous genetics number for heritability. And so that's kind of interesting. But I think these genomic methods, particularly the type that Jonathan's applying right now, are really going to give us that sense of risk and a test for risk. And I think in the end we'll have actually a test that comes out of that type of work.
Thank you. The example quoted here, which is just illustrative, I think, of what many of us heard before. My family, 3 out of 5 of ME, 2 are severely affected, children and a mother, and one brother is healthy. So that's the sort of, it's a bit more than the 1 in 4, but it's these are the sort of issues that I meet again and again, you know. The other thing is this curious link with autism, which we've noticed with the Gulf War vets as well, but autism is really regarded as a developmental disorder and something that's taking place in utero and beyond. But have you got any comments on the autism?
Yeah, I do, because I mentioned that the virus integrates into CPG islands and promoters, and just after birth, you reset your entire methylation in the brain, and your neurons won't connect. So it could be an acquired developmental disorder. And Jill James at Arkansas has done a lot of work on methylation defects in autism. So we're doing a collaboration now to see if we can make correlations with that and the integration of the virus if it's there.
Thank you, that's very helpful. Anyone else want to comment?
Just to say, clinically, in my fatigue syndrome patients, I see an awful lot of mother-daughter, mother-son combinations. And if the case that it's primarily a mitochondrial problem, mitochondria, of course, come down the female line, and that would explain many of the genetic links that we see.
Yeah.
That's very interesting.
Thanks. Another question, this is addressed to you, Nancy. Could the immune system changes cause miscarriages in women with CFS?
Oh, certainly. The immune system's all very involved in pregnancy and maintaining pregnancy and promoting. The immune system is actually what promotes the eventual birthing process. So if something got disconnected there, you could imagine just immune system alone. Now there's a lot of bugs that cause miscarriage too, and you shouldn't ignore that possibility. And some of the viruses we're talking about in chronic fatigue are so-called torch viruses, which are viruses that are famous for basically messing up pregnancies or causing fetal problems. And the body recognizes fetal problems and it miscarries. So there's quite likely the possibility. Is there any proof yet? I don't think the only person that published a pregnancy study is Tony Komaroff, and it was a negative study. I think in clinical practice, and please echo this, pregnancy is a very interesting experience for chronic fatigue patients. Some people get much better during pregnancy, and they have an increased blood volume, they have increased cortisol levels, they have a lot of things that could be going on during pregnancy that would be corrective. I certainly see more of that than anything else in the woman that I've cared for. But some people have horrible pregnancies, particularly if nausea is involved, and then you've got a real problem.
Generally, the outlook for pregnancy with CFS is usually
A healthy
encouraging,
baby.
yeah.
Yeah, a healthy baby. I have never seen in my practice in 26 years a baby that had a problem. So I would be encouraged.
Good. Thank you very much.
Another point about pregnancy, in my experience, is that we do see a lot more patients that have a positive response post-pregnancy, very few that have a negative. I'd say the majority sort of end up kind of at the same point. But it's interesting, the ones that do well. And on that note, it's also intriguing that all pregnant women get transfused by their offspring stem cells in the last trimester. And one wonders what those stem cell transmission that cause chimerism in the female, what they have to do with improvement.
Thank you. Right, a question here about environment. What are the effects of a warm climate on ME/CFS sufferers? Have we got any evidence?
Wait, warm and dry or warm and moist? Because there's two different things.
If you take your choice, I know of one case where warm and dry is very helpful, but I don't know if that's a general thing or just
Well, dehydration's rough on chronic fatigue. So if you're a hydrating person in a warm climate, you do pretty well. But it's also vasodilatory, so you pool more. So the people with the big autonomic problems, they have a lot more problems in the summer than they do in the winter. Right. So, but you can, do things to prevent that. So personally, I think warm is wonderful.
A very interesting phenomena. We talked this morning about the left atrium squeezes really hard as a compensatory mechanism for left ventricular filling problems. But when the left atrium is squeezing really hard, it releases a peptide called atrial natriuretic peptide, and it has two features. One is a potent vasodilator, And the second is it reduces blood volume. So there may be some sort of feedback mechanism the body's trying to adjust for this heavy squeeze by thinking it'll give reduce the afterload by vasodilatation, and perhaps, I guess, reduce preload by dropping the blood volume. So it's a very interesting phenomena that this squeezing left atrium could bring about both vasodilatory problems that you can see in this disease, as well as reduced blood volume.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. Right. For all the long-term effects of ME, most of today we've been looking at people with ME/CFS who are relatively newly diagnosed. I'm not quite sure that's right, actually. I think there's a lot has been said about the older people, but many of them are newly diagnosed. Has anybody done any tests on people who have ME for over 30 to 40 years, who still have symptoms? Is there any way of preventing recurrent acute episodes, particularly with a virus infection, e.g. influenza or new viruses? I think that's targeted at anybody.
I can just make a couple of quick comments. There was a couple studies that have been published. Fred Freeberg published one study on people who have been sick for longer periods of time, 10 years and beyond. Generally, they do find some additional symptoms in cognitive areas. We have a group that we've been following in Chicago that had with our community-based study approximately 10 years ago that we've recently re-interviewed. So we're going to be talking about some of the characteristics of those people in some papers that are now coming out and at the Ottawa meeting next year at the IICFS. So certainly we'll be talking about that. I think the key issue here is that there's a dearth of studies of natural history of individuals over time. It's absolutely critically needed. The more community-based those studies are, the better. But we do need long-term studies to find out some of the consequences of this illness over time. Right now, it's really pitiful, the amount of information that's available.
Thank you. Dr. Chowdhury, who did some very interesting pathology, only done it on two people who died, but he did show that the inflammatory markers that he detected by staining techniques on the spinal cord tissue were different in a 20-year-old case than in a 7-year-old case. And I think it's come out generally that the time frame does change, doesn't it? In the time frame, the actual expression of the illness does change as we go along, from what people have said already today. So it's a bit of a moving change, really, moving target of the patient's illness. So it does happen that way. But we do need more work. Another question. Right.
If I could just make a point, Malcolm.
Yes, please. John.
That chronic fatigue syndrome, as we know, is a chronic pro-inflammatory condition without specific or obvious organ localization. And we do know as well that some people with autoimmune disease have a prodrome of a similar type. I was talking to Dr. Fry here from Arizona about this earlier, and a couple of other people in the past as well. Just wonder what the panel think of that. The possibility that CFS-like disease could be a prodrome to autoimmune disease.
I feel rather strongly that way. We published some very early HLA papers that saw DR4, DQ3, very much autoimmune types of gene patterns before we had all this lovely genomic work, but we were looking more at the tissue typing types of genes that can predict disease. And they would have predicted autoimmune. They're the same genes that predict rheumatoid arthritis or Sjogren's or diabetes. And we saw them with the same kind of frequency, the relative risk 4 to 9-fold, roughly 4 to 9, which is as good as you see in diabetes or rheumatoid arthritis. So I think that there's, at least from that data, that would strike towards an autoimmune predisposition. Secondly, this chronic immune activation is seen just like this. If you wanted to pick a comparative group and you picked out rheumatoid arthritis, it wouldn't be too far from what we're seeing here. Maybe without the NK and cytotoxic T cell defects, but the cytokine panels and the immune activation would look very, very similar to what we see. So, and finally, there's a lot of confusion over what's autoimmune and what's infection and where the boundaries lie. You know, in MS, there's still a great deal of debate over autoimmune, even though it's treated very much as an autoimmune disease, and even to the point of immunosuppression that would really be kind of frightening in the face of a virus. MS still has the big question mark: is there still viral reactivation going on? Yet it's considered autoimmune. And as you point out, the prodrome, there's a host of literature dating back to when I was in medical school, we won't say when that was, that acute mono precipitating rheumatoid arthritis, precipitating lupus, and why is it a young person's disease? And let's not forget gender in all of this. Women get autoimmune diseases way more often than men do, by far, by far, by far. And yet women with chronic fatigue obviously far outnumber men with the chronic fatigue or ME. So I'm definitely not out of the autoimmune market, and also whether or not it's a long-term consequence or an active participant. Just because we don't know what to look for doesn't mean it's not there.
Yeah.
You know?
I'd also like to say something about that from the work that we've done with the persistent virus infections of the heart. That was classically considered an autoimmune disease until we demonstrated the virus was present. So they've clearly shown that autoimmunity occurred at that stage. I think that often if you have a persisting infection, you're likely to induce autoimmune responses, and you may also have more chronic infection because of inflammation that you're seeing with the autoimmunity. So it can be a sort of cycling process.
Yeah, I may also add that just this past 12 months, we saw a nice cluster of lupus patients that occurred within about a month or 5 weeks after a prolonged respiratory gastrointestinal infections. We actually tried to investigate their antibodies for the 11 viruses. We couldn't really find it. Several patients had positive viral protein in the stomach, but they clearly, within about 4 weeks, developed full-blown lupus. And these are really unusual. And there's actually more men in this group, and they're all young. They're 20, 25 years old, and actually we even saw a couple of African Americans, which are very unusual to have developed lupus. So there's no question a virus infection, which we don't know, can trigger something early. But in the chronic fatigue CFS patients, they actually don't transform that often. I mean, it's really relatively rare in my experience. They don't go into lupus or rheumatoid arthritis after many years. You've seen many more patients than I have.
Right, so thank you very much. A series of questions now about treatment, possible treatments. Given no treatment is available in the UK, what can the panel recommend as helpful from the supplements and things we can buy over the counter, vitamins, food supplements and things like that? Chinese herbs. So whoever wants to take on this one, there's a lady in the audience who could say a lot. But John, the one specific question was addressed to you was, where can we get the Chinese herbs that you were mentioning?
I just want to make a comment first, Dr. Myhill's great work. I mean, if you're just giving magnesium and some vitamins to patients and you're having this much problem, I would be very hesitant to recommend anything else. But in the United States, I basically, we all went into this field. We want to help patients. So we basically decided, you have to try things that may work. And with trial and errors, we found a few things that actually help. I mean, I tried gamma globulin, interferon, and tried the intravenous antivirals. Some of them are a little bit toxic, but the Chinese herb is fairly well tolerated if you go very slow. You just don't go very fast. You take a small dose, work up. If you can't tolerate it, you'll know within the first 2 weeks to 4 weeks. But if you can move it up to 4 to 6 per day, and if that doesn't work within 3 months, then it's not going to work. A rare patient will respond after 3 months. Yeah. So that's sort of the guideline. You can get it at, I think it was the website, equilibrandhealth.com.
Yeah, thank you. We've got the website. We can put it out with the conference proceedings, yeah.
Just a comment here, because I think if you look at this table and speakers you've had in the past, I mean, Dan Peterson, there's Dan way back there, and John and Paul. Think of how many people here have in their clinical practices, without financial support from NIH, taught us so much about this illness. And what they did was go 5-10 steps further than normal. They with their compassion, treated their patients the best knowledge that they had in their hands, and I think you're finding that right here. And then they went that next step forward, and they wrote it down, they quantitated it, and they published it. And that taught a lot of other people something. It's not the best study to not have a placebo-controlled phase 3 powered with 400 each group kind of thing to guide our hands, which is what we really need. But we don't have that money. We're not being funded to do that. And you know, we write those grants and we do our best, and we're, you know, tickling this field forward in the therapeutic front. But that knowledge is coming from this. That knowledge is coming from the experiences of compassionate, knowledgeable, thoughtful physicians who try to do their very best. Yeah. And then, thank you, teach us from your mistakes as well as from your successes. And I think that we all try to practice medicine the best way we know how with the tools we have, because you're sick right now. And then we hope that 10 years from now we have guidelines that say, in this perfect study, you know, perfectly powered study, the risk of this is that, and the benefit is that, and that really guides our hand the way we have in HIV. But that took 20 years and billions of dollars to give us those kinds of guidelines that are updated and really sharp and crisp and clear. And we don't have that in this field. So we do what we can.
Yeah. Lenny?
For those of you who are interested in a comprehensive review of alternative and complementary medicine with this illness and fibromyalgia, the last issue of Journal of Alternative and Complementary Medicine had a review article by Nicole Porter, myself, and a couple others. Probably not surprisingly, massage was rated very positively, but short-term effects. One of the more promising ones that we noticed in our review was actually Qigong and meditation, so something to think about. However, I think what Nancy said and what others have alluded to is that most of the research in this area has not been well controlled, although there's lots of anecdotes of success and positive reactions to different types of treatments. The drug companies certainly have not invested in this. NIH has certainly not supported this. There really needs to be more good studies in this area because, as we know, many patients very much endorse these methods. We just need to know which ones are best.
Paul, you were cut off in your prime when you were making your presentation. You didn't get as far as the treatments, the magnesium that you mentioned to me and the B12.
You know, a lot of my patients ask me what would be my desert island choice if I were banished to a desert island. What would I take with me and leave everything else behind? And there are four things that always come to mind, and they're the things that we started out, Dan and I started out using them simply because they felt they seemed appropriate for the symptom relief we were looking at. But I believe the reason that they stood over 20 years of time is they actually are either immune modulators or they're redox modulators. So it seems to me that the things that I would look for in the future are immunomodulators or redox modulators. It was quite interesting to me that clonazepam or Klonopin, which was one of the first drugs that we used to treat sleep disorder, turns out to block a benzodiazepine receptor inside the mitochondria. It's called the mitochondrial benzo receptor, and actually inhibits RIRR, which stands for reactive oxygen species induced release of reactive oxygen species, a complicated word. But it turns out that Klonopin is actually a potent redox modulator protecting the brain and other structures against oxidative stress. And we started out using it as a sleep medicine instead as a powerful redox modulator. And in the same vein is a very doxepin elixir. Again, used to keep people asleep longer because they tend to wake up in the middle of the night, and it's pretty sedating through the night, but it's also an H2 blocker and is also a potent immune modulator and probably the most potent H2 blocker known to man. Magnesium is a wonderful thing to apply to this disease, almost as much as you can take, as often as you can take it, but not orally. It doesn't work that well as oral tablets. So magnesium can be taken under the tongue or on the skin or even injected. And finally, hydroxycobalamin has been a wonderful therapeutic agent over the years. Not methylcobalamin, not cyanocobalamin, but hydroxycobalamin, which dissociates into free cobalamin more easily and can act as a nitric oxide scavenger and can help reduce peroxynitrite, an important player perhaps in the redox issue. Artesunate is another powerful NF-kappa B inhibitor, therefore a powerful redox modulator that we found utility in this disease. So it just seems to me that things that seem to stand the test of time are those things that either turn out to be immunomodulators in some way or redox modulators in some way. And those are the things I would look at going forward.
Thank you. I was going to say artesunate, for those who don't recognize the drug, is an antimalarial drug. It's a new one. It's widely used as the backstop for treating resistant malaria. So whether that could be prescribed off-label, I don't know. But if you're in England, you're probably unlikely to get malaria in England. But if you go somewhere else, you might be inducing resistance in malaria parasites, which is not a good idea. But it is an interesting molecule. Sorry, Paul, you were going to say something?
Yes, we've been using our echo terrain map, which I didn't get a chance to show because the echo is very sensitive to redox shifts, and you can see positive and negative redox shifts very quickly and very easily. And what surprised me was how bad fish oil looks on echo terrain map. And fish oil, as you know, is an omega-3 primarily oil, and omega-3 is very vulnerable to oxidation.
Yes.
And when oxidized is actually not a very good thing to have in your body. The omega-6 is more resistant to oxidation, but it doesn't include the omega-3 series. Therefore, they're both essential fatty acids. You need both of them. So we went searching around for which oil did best on the echo terrain map, and it turned out that a high-grade olive oil from Italy called Colavita, the organic olive oil, was the best mix of oils. It contains about a 3-to-1 ratio, omega-6 to omega-3, and looked wonderful on the echo terrain map. So I basically took all my patients off fish oil, all my patients off omega-6 derivatives, and put them basically on a couple of tablespoons of Colavita olive oil. And having said that, when I looked at some substandard olive oils, the kind that are cheap on the shelves, they're awful on the echo terrain map. They're actually end up with a ratio of like 12-to-1 omega-6 versus 3, so they get oxidized. I think their omega-3 series gets oxidized out of that. So I like olive oil. I don't like fish oil, and I don't like omega-6s all by themselves.
I reckon, yes, the omega-3, omega-6 is a very interesting story, and there are different views on it, but I think we're going to have to leave that one there for the moment. I think we've covered the sleep question that someone asked about there as well. On the magnesium, I think I'm concerned about the amount of cost that is required to buy magnesium species, glycinates, aspartates, lysinates, taurates, all very expensive. But Epsom salts in a bath will absorb through the skin. That's just been two postdocs had to do this with Rosemary Waring, and she showed that it gets in. So it will get in, and I think it was Sarah who was talking about putting in a cream and rubbing on the skin, just an ordinary aqueous cream, and it'll go through the skin. So you don't have to pay for the earth and fall for some of this rather dodgy advertising that some people make and claim for these sort of variations. You can do it with quite simple stuff and quite cheaply, and I'm concerned that should be the case. B12 I think we've dealt with. We've dealt with the herbals. Ribose. What's the experience of the panel with ribose as a... I'll come to you in a minute, sir.
Yeah, I've looked at D-ribose as well on the echo terrain map. It's universally negative, actually.
Is it?
And if you think about it, you go from glucose to D-ribose, and when you do that, you make NADPH. And NADPH reducing power, as it is very important in the maintenance of glutathione. It's very important in the maintenance of the P450 detox pathway. The problem, therefore, if you're going from glucose, which is the anabolic pathway, glucose to D-ribose to make NADPH, guess what happens when you give D-ribose? You basically feedback inhibit the movement from glucose to D-ribose and thereby feedback inhibit the formation of NADPH. And we can see this again on echo terrain mapping. D-ribose does not appear to be a very good thing to give in this disease. I think because there's basically a deficiency in the anabolic pathway and a deficiency of the movement from glucose to D-ribose for sure, But if you give Dribose, you just block that movement even further.
Yeah. Are you going to share that, Nancy, or is that just for private conversation?
Sorry.
No, it's okay. I just wondered if it was something that the pearl of wisdom we might all want to benefit from. Right. Sarah has produced this supplements regimen, really, which many people found very, very helpful. Would you like to just say a little tiny bit about it, Sarah, so that we can get it from the horse's mouth again? Instead of the
regime of supplements I use to support mitochondria, I've actually learned from the American cardiologist, Dr. Stephen Sinatra, who uses this package extensively for low output cardiac states and heart failure with good results. The time when the ribose is a problem is when I have a patient who has a fermenting gut instead of a digesting gut, because mitochondria, from an evolutionary perspective, are derived from bacteria. And therefore, the mitochondrial package will theoretically help gut bacteria to flourish. And if you have gut bacteria in the upper gut, that means foods get fermented to products like D-lactate, to alcohol, to hydrogen sulfide, all of which will inhibit mitochondria. So the mitochondrial package works well so long as gut function is good. And that's my experience.
What's your packet? What do you mean?
What do you recommend?
What is in this packet?
But it's D-ribose, which is the raw material from which ATP is made. It's L-carnitine, acetyl L-carnitine, which effectively is the way that acetate groups are delivered from the cytosol into mitochondria themselves, which is the fuel. It's coenzyme Q10, which is the major antioxidant within mitochondria. Magnesium, and NAD, which is the raw material for NAD and NADH. So it's those 5 things, and the doses are on my website if anybody wants them.
If I could just mention a couple of supplements that I've recommended only to a handful of patients, but they've all said that they help them. And the first is DMAE, or diaminoaminoethanol, which enhances levels of acetylcholine in the brain, and it helps with cognitive function. And you take it in the morning, and you have enhanced cognitive function during the day, and then better sleep at night, supposedly. Although you have to be careful if there's any chance of getting pregnant, because it has a theoretical risk of neural tube defect. And the other one is L-glutamine powder, which is an amino acid that is taken mixed with water or juice that aids the repair of the gastrointestinal tract. And I've tried both of these personally, and they're very good. And the handful of patients I've recommended them to also say they're very good. I don't know if anybody's any expertise or thoughts on that.
I have a comment on one more, if you don't mind.
Go, please.
The Japanese, and you brought it up with your CoQ10 thing, the Japanese did a lovely little study a couple years back, and I got to hear the presentation. Went into a little more detail in the paper that came out last year. Here they use CoQ10 in a placebo-controlled study for fatigue, not in chronic fatigue or ME, but for general population burnout type of fatigue. For 1 week, brought them into an exercise laboratory, put them on an exercise challenge, and measured various things. And this is how it came out. So there was 60 milligrams of ubiquinol twice a day, which is about 200 milligrams of CoQ10 twice a day. And for just a week, it was amazing, just a week, they brought them in and they measured CPK, LDH, free radicals, fatigue perception, fatigue by repetitions of a muscle, okay? And then they put them on the bike for 2 hours. That's pretty impressive right there. Yeah. And then, all of you just went, ah. And then they measured all of that again, and then again 4 hours later. And what they saw was in the placebo group, after 2 hours of biking, first at the baseline, people were relatively the same, less perceived fatigue, maybe a few more reps, but not a lot of difference at baseline. But when you put them on this exercise challenge, the placebo group saw a bump in CPK and LDH, which are your muscle breakdown enzymes. It means that you worked your muscle so much that it went into an anaerobic state, and it released enough free radicals to actually damage the cell, and some of the cells actually popped and released enzymes. So it's more or less what that said. And then they measured free radicals, but in a very excellent laboratory. They're really hard to measure, and so a lot of the data is disregarded. But this was a laboratory that I would respect. And then and they had measurable free radicals. The treated group had, this just blew me away as a clinician because I like things I can see. I'm a very visual person. They had no LDH bump, no CPK bump, no measurable free radicals, less fatigue, increased reps, more rapid recovery time. So I went home and I put everybody on CoQ10. My whole family's on CoQ10. I mean, young, old, it doesn't matter. I mean, I was just like, okay, free radicals are bad for you, and this really proved it to me. I was very happy with that.
Thank you very much. I think it's going to have to be the last one, but in the light of what we've talked about exercise now, in view of the widespread diastolic dysfunction, this is for you, I think, particularly, Paul, in ME/CFS, what are the implications of using graded exercise as a therapeutic intervention? Thank you all.
For you.
Yeah. Well, I don't think too much of graded exercise intervention in this illness, but I do think that people need to move and not lay in bed. It's a bad idea to just sit there and lay 24/7. That you have to get up and you have to walk around and you have to do what you can do within the limits of your illness. But the whole idea that you could take a disease like this and exercise your way to health is foolishness. It's insane. And these people, they're already having great difficulty diastolically trying to maintain the output even in the rest state because they poorly fill. You can imagine what they have to do when you increase the demand for an exercise, and then their little ventricle has to work even harder to overcome the filling problems to develop the cardiac output necessary to exercise. And so we see this expressed, as I showed you, in ventricular dyssynchrony. I mean, merely the head-up tilt can cause ventricular dyssynchrony and strain patterns. God knows what it does when they actually exercise. So I don't think too much of exercise as a way forward in this illness.
Martin Lerner, who was a former speaker at one of our former conferences, has a scheme which I think it's on the net, it's published, and he gives a graded point score. And he said, don't start exercising until you reach 0.7 on his score sheet, which means that you're capable of doing some exercise and building on it. If you start too early, you just nose down backwards, if that's allowed to do gymnastically. So you just simply go backwards. So there is a danger, a serious danger. And there is a salutary story about an MP who had been advised to exercise in the gym at the House of Commons and dropped dead walking over Westminster Bridge. So be careful. But it is part of the beginnings of getting better when you've got the right stage.
We recently published a paper looking at a variety of these different types of non-pharmacological interventions and looking for some of the components in them. And one of the things that we found that actually led to some improvements in patients was that to the extent that individuals learned how to monitor their energy levels, learned how to respect how much they did, learned how in some ways to learn to stay within that energy envelope and not to have relapses because they went beyond it, those were the patients that seemed to get the most benefit out of these interventions.
Thank you very much.
Just this exercise thing, it's very important. I mean, I presented, the average of 8 minutes, you had a cytokine cascade going on. It was pretty dramatic and very clear data. But Chuck Lapp published, or rather presented a paper some years back, about 7 years now, using what he called the 5 up, 5 down principle, where he showed that it demonstrated relapse if you exceeded this limit. Yeah. But he also showed that if you lay people down for 5 minutes and then got them back up, they could do another little bit. So in a very practical way, I integrate that into my advice and say start small, a couple few minutes, take a break, couple few minutes, take a break, flat break, because hey, the autonomic nervous system is a player here, and you're trying to perfuse, keep things quiet, but then tax it again, and breaking it up in bits, I think, is much more successful than pushing through.
Thank you very much. Well, that's it, folks, for this year. Big thank you to all our speakers for the panel.